As I said, I'm Dr. Gus Andrews. This should be, can the fight against disinformation really scale? But I'm going to start by adjusting my title. You'll notice I'm mostly going to say misinformation. As a community, we're mostly saying dis to mean deliberately manipulative bad information, and mis to mean the larger category of bad information. I'm mostly going to talk about the larger category, but as you'll see, I'm about to make the case that neither mis nor dis is actually useful to solving the problem. How would we approach the problem differently if we started from the assumption that there is no such thing as misinformation or disinformation, only information? Because there are two powerful forces in the world that already act as if this is the case. One of these forces is the internet. It's been built to offer information without gatekeepers, right? The other is the people using the internet. As an anthropologist, this is how I approach the question, right? I start from how people use information on their own terms, and I empirically observe them in the field, not in the lab. I see good information and bad information as forming opposing teams. The teams have colors they wear to show they belong to the club. They have chants they repeat. They have players they idolize. And the way they chant and what they wear to show their pride contributes to their sense of who they are. Team Western empirical science has its own ways to demonstrate you're a superfan, like citing your sources, or on a more superficial level, giving unmasked people dirty looks. So face it, team science, you ask people to demonstrate team loyalty this way, too. I bring up the team metaphor because whether you want to admit it or not, all information has a social life, even scientific facts. Starting from this perspective, let me explain why our dominant approaches to misinformation as they stand are deeply flawed. Right now, two major approaches make up the lion's share of projects in the Credibility Coalition, which is a central organizing space for the misinformation fighting effort started by journalists and technologists. These two approaches are, first, fact-checking, and second, large-scale technical solutions. This graphic shows a little more than half of the projects in the Credibility Coalition's catalog that are listed as doing fact-checking. They include projects like ProFact Moldova, Ecuador, Czechia, and Voice of San Diego, which are all grounded in local news. There are also newcomer nonprofits like Full Fact and MetaFact that claim a broader scope. Here's Credibility Coalition's projects using the second approach: algorithms, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the blockchain to identify misinformation at scale. These approaches start from a few flawed a priori assumptions. One of these is that facts should be at the center of our fight against misinformation. Another is that it's easy to convince people to abandon their team to trust our facts, our good information. And those two faulty assumptions underlie the third, which is that we know what it looks like to fight information at scale. To solve the problem, we need to understand why people join team conspiracy theory. We need to reckon with how that team identifies with certain kinds of information. And if we do that, then maybe we have a chance at winning those people over to team evidence-based reality. We need to start by recognizing that facts and information are social. What do I mean? Am I some sort of loosey-goosey postmodernist making the argument that facts can be whatever you want them to be? Man, no. Some of you team science fans are out there going, that's preposterous, you can't argue with the natural world. But team science's facts don't spring fully formed from the natural world. In fact, the word fact, as we know it, didn't even come into usage until the 17th century. Historian David Wooten points out that there is, in fact, no classical Greek or Latin word for fact. It was in the 1600s that experimental scientists started to call an appeal to evidence a fact. Notice that construction, right? A fact is not the same thing as evidence. It is an appeal to evidence. It's evidence plus a human being going, here's my evidence. This is why it's a fact. This machine measured it. That other guy I'm citing says so also, and so forth. It's evidence with peer review, with citations and then some. Consider how many human arguments it took for people to accept facts from Galileo, Pasteur, Darwin. Those arguments took place in royal courts, legal courts, churches and schools, as well as scientific journals, social spaces. And facts aren't permanent. New teams emerge to make new appeals to evidence and new facts. For example, Darwin's rival, Lamarck, regained some credibility since most of us learned in school that he was wrong. Lamarck was the guy who argued that giraffes stretched their necks and passed their trait on to their offspring. So team epigenetics found new evidence here and started to score better against team evolution. Looking at the historical record, there is no guarantee that team science wins. If we want to win, and I think most of us do, we need to understand what kind of socio-political maneuvers it takes to win. For example, fact-checking, right? This used to be a name for work that professional journalists did, but the public hasn't always assumed that newspapers printed facts. You may or may not be aware, but in the 1800s, journalists had an even worse reputation than they do now. Yellow journalism was what people called sensationalist news they mistrusted. What critics said about William Randolph Hearst is a little bit like what's said about the media today. So how did team journalism turn it around? How did they demonstrate that their facts were trustworthy? They sought professional status, the same kind of professional status that scientists had built up in the 1800s and that medicine has enjoyed since medieval times. How did they do that? Guess what? Social maneuvers, once again. Joseph Pulitzer founded the Columbia Journalism School in 1892. He founded the prize bearing its name. Professionalization, this process, is when a group of people decides there's certain specialized knowledge that they and nobody else are in charge of, like doctors saying not midwives anymore, or psychologists saying hypnosis but not mesmerism. They set up professional associations, codes of ethics, gates to keep people out, diplomas, licenses, training that you need in order to call yourself a professional. For journalists, that includes rules for fact-checking. People training to be both scientists and journalists learn their team's approved methods to build facts. So recap about facts. They're an appeal to evidence by human beings, teams of them, supposedly playing by certain rules, so we'll trust them and their facts. So, fans of team evidence-based reality, pardon me, don't get confused. What you trust is not the evidence itself. What you trust is the facts. And the facts are always an appeal to evidence, and what you trust is that professional scientists and journalists are using those rules to make a case for their facts. I'm not here to tell you that you shouldn't trust facts. What I'm here to clarify is why team misinformation identifies with other experts and trusts their facts. So let's unpack what we know about trust. Because both fact-checking and algorithmic approaches to misinformation make bad assumptions about trust as well. Trust in social research doesn't mean what it means in computer engineering. To those of us who study human beings, trust is cognitive. It's your neuron's expectation that someone will continue to behave as they have behaved previously. So it has a historical aspect. It relies on past interactions. It's developmental. It grows within an individual, or it doesn't. It's social. It grows between individuals, or it doesn't. And it's limited. Dunbar's number, which is the estimated limit to human group sizes, is debated, but historically, humans have only interacted with a couple hundred people tops. And this presents a challenge to scaling trust. Trust is contextual and relative. If I've met this furry guy here before, or others of his species, I may or may not trust him not to bite me, or children, or poop on the rug. I do not trust him to drive a car. So tell me, are your algorithms really smart enough to get trust right? Because facts are social, we have to consider what personal experiences have misinformation spreaders had with team science or with team medicine, with team journalism, team media, with government. How do they feel about the professional class generally? And why? What did their parents say about doctors or journalists or scientists? How were they presented in the media? Honestly, I think it's unsurprising we see so little trust in medical facts at this moment in history. Consider the opioid epidemic. How many people in the United States had their trust in medicine shaken when the entire healthcare system insisted it was a fact that opioids were not addictive? that science said they could safely be used in higher and higher doses, and then their loved ones grew addicted to drugs their doctors prescribed them. Think about what Purdue Pharma did to convince all of us that opioids were safe. They used what appeared to all but the most attentive eye to be science facts. They used journal articles, graphs, PR pieces that got turned into news reports, and so journalism gets a black eye there as well. They co-opted trusted experts. They wined and dined our doctors, convincing them that higher doses were safe. And that's not even deeper history, like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, or American eugenicists forcibly sterilizing people. This 1945 article, around the time my grandmother was young, from a professional medical journal, talked about forcibly sterilizing patients for being mentally defective, which could mean, as this article says, for epilepsy, forgery, or skipping school, or for not being white. This was one of many such articles written by MDs. So is it any wonder there's a large group of people out there who don't just trust medical facts, who might trust other sources of information? I guarantee misinformation spreaders are building their own team from people they trust. Their friends, social media influencers, anyone who appeals to evidence they can see with their own eyes. Experts they find trustworthy because they're familiar to them, because of experiences they have personally had starting in childhood. We can probably trace it back to how they feel about school. Were they really given the opportunity to succeed in science class, or did it seem like people like them were bad at science? Were they exposed to research methods that empowered them or exploited them? Team loyalties go back for generations, and some religious leaders still reject Darwin's appeals to evidence, as in the Scopes monkey trial. They preach that evolution is a lie. Francesca Tripodi wrote this great report on what we could call team scriptural inference, which is basically conservative Christians applying Bible study reading practices to make their own facts from what they see in the media. The idea that 5G causes COVID, as Patrick talked about, sounds cockney maybe to us, but the idea that radio waves are hazardous to your health has been around as long as we've had the ability to produce radio waves. To those already convinced of this fact, attributing COVID to radio frequencies seems obvious. Team QAnon makes their own appeals to evidence. QAnon enthusiasts and anti-vaxxers encourage people to do the research, to find their own evidence, make their own facts. Expand your thinking is the team chant. This logo from a t-shirt shows off a number of ways Team QAnon appeals to evidence. Good versus evil, again, suggests a biblical reading. They appeal to future evidence that proves past drops from Q. So they're relying on evidence, they just don't play by Team Science's don't cherry pick evidence rule. They also use some of the same facts as the rest of us. Huber here is US Attorney John Huber, who investigated Hillary Clinton while in Trump's Justice Department. So you might expect QAnon followers think government facts are never trustworthy, but at the time the shirt was printed, they were still hoping that Huber's legal documents would yield their kind of facts. The shirt also refers to the 5 Eyes, the international intelligence alliance Edward Snowden's leaks put out in the public eye. So again, evidence that most of us accept as fact. Team QAnon may have their own logic, but they also value documents that are considered factual by teams journalism and law. So you can't just fix this by downranking conspiracy texts, right? It's not about what Team Conspiracy reads, it's about how they read it and whose interpretation they trust. If you're familiar with machine learning, you know this is not the kind of nuance technical solutions can detect. I challenge you to make me an AI that can distinguish between QAnon's and Snowden's thoughts about 5 Eyes. Good luck with that. Part of the problem is those a priori assumptions that we are bringing to the table. As Janelle Shane demonstrates amply on her AI Weirdness blog, if you tell your AI it's looking for COVID lungs, it will find them in stuffed giraffes. So tell your AI that it has to find misinformation or it has to find facts, and it will certainly try to please you if none of the above is actually in the picture. Tell me, you clever developers, how exactly do you build the human understanding of trust into your algorithm? What indicators does it rely on? Retweets don't equal endorsement or trust, neither are connections. Those of us on the security side of things know bad actors social engineer people into adding them as LinkedIn contacts all the time. It's time to admit misinformation is not a problem we can solve with an algorithm. It's a social problem. It's a social problem that tech company business models have brought into being. From Web 2.0 onwards, scalable online business models have always explicitly been built on the elimination of professionals trained to vet information. Craigslist and Google started chipping away at the ad revenue of news at the turn of the century, but the real damage was done in the year Facebook introduced its news feed. Guess who gets laid off first when news organizations have to tighten their belts? Hint, it's not reporters, it's fact checkers. The tech industry considers eliminating editors a feature, not a bug. As Dave Weiner, one of the developers of RSS, summed up well, he was excited that on the internet, sources will go direct and prove that publishers, editors, and fact checkers do unnecessary work. Editing can sometimes improve the effectiveness of writing, he wrote, and we see where that turned out. Let's also not forget that Google's PageRank was created to rank scientific citations, for that matter. Team social media has effectively flattened Team's journalism and science when it comes to fighting for facts. And in light of this, it's very, very interesting that Meta is pouring money into supporting third-party fact-checkers all over the globe. So, I've dismantled your best hopes about information, both good and mis, facts and trust. Thanks, you ivory tower jerk, you may be saying. That's cute and all, but how the hell am I supposed to apply this? Chris pointed out earlier to me that most of the recommendations I'm about to make track with the Aspen Institute Commission on Information Disorder. I was not involved in producing that report, and I do disagree with it on a few points, but I refer you to it. First, I'd suggest that when investing in fact-checking, support solutions that are based in local institutions that people already trust. Local solutions are more likely to succeed. Random fact-checking outlets that are floating onto the scene unmoored from local context, by contrast, are not going to have an impact. And do note that local news institutions that people trust is a rocky field to navigate. I've been doing it for about 20 years. Good luck identifying local political fault lines or news outlets that may or may not be in the pocket of corrupt dictators. If you're going to have fact-checkers, why not hire editors or curators? Only having fact-checkers is fighting a rearguard and after-the-fact battle. At the very least, learn from older projects. This is not our first content moderation goat rodeo. We shouldn't invent trust and safety from whole cloth. Learn from veterans who have been weeding out conspiracy theories, fraud, and flame wars for years at places like Reddit and Metafilter. What would they put into algorithms? What are their best practices? Regarding scalable technical solutions, the public needs to know, as Chris said, how platforms work before we can build policy on them. Algorithmic transparency and accountability will be vital. Tech companies need to hire qualitative social researchers as well to help them think through the implications of algorithms, or at the very least, make them available to the public. Expose algorithms to more perspectives, hire women, people of color, queer folks, and people from different class backgrounds, especially, and treat them fairly, act on their advice, and don't fire them for a change. It hurts your bottom line. If it hurts your bottom line, that profit was not yours to begin with. Another modest Swiftian proposal from me. Algorithms should not promote strong emotions, any strong emotions, positive or negative. We learned from Facebook's emotion experiment that algorithms can drive us to extremes. We must require them to do the opposite. Make social media news feeds unsticky again, even if it hurts the bottom line. Did we actually miss the boat on sensational news in 1958 when Edward R. Murrow had beef with commercializing TV news? Is this a multi-industry problem? Yes, absolutely, but that's a topic for another talk. If you don't want to take my Swiftian advice and eat the juicy babies of your business model, there's always another way to scale the fight against misinformation. We can argue that feed algorithms serve the same function as editors. Without them, we drown in garbage. Section 230 should not apply to algorithm-curated social media. The model profits from prioritizing certain information with harmful effects. Hold Meta and anyone else with an algorithmic feed liable. For that matter, Section 230 shouldn't apply to a company that is pouring money into fact-checking and pretending it's somehow not a news outlet. Personally, I hope to fight misinformation on a human scale. I'm currently proposing a design research project to build trust on a community level, and I'm hoping to convene conflict resolution specialists, trauma experts, cult member reprogrammers, and gang interrupters to understand their best practices. If you also, personally, want to join the fight at a human scale, public schools are your local Team Empirical Science fan club. Support them. Fund public schools so they can attract great teachers. And by that I mean teachers who welcome kids born to all teams, regardless of social class, and gently encourage them towards the facts. It sucks, it's Kafkaesque, but Richard Feynman did it, and so can you. Show up for those school board meetings that are melting down right now. Be a calming presence. Be on the textbook book review boards. Like I said, it sucks, but Feynman did it, and you can too. There's my talk. Thanks.